Once again, hello to all of you. Thank you for joining this class, which is the last class in the main sequence of our course on the four measurable attitudes. And just as a reminder, as an addition to this course, there will be two events next weekend. One of them will be me and Christian Howard teaching on the different facets of joy, not limited to empathetic joy and rejoicing, but covering a number of other facets of delight that we can cultivate through contemplative practice. And then on Sunday, at our usual time, I'll do a little presentation on how we can see the four immeasurables within the larger context of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where we can certainly see a certain connection between the idea and the practice of the four immeasurables and, say, the Buddhist teachings on karma, Buddhist teachings on the nature of the mind, Buddhist teachings on Vajrayana practice, Buddhist teachings on Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and so forth. So, of course, love, compassion, and so forth are very deeply integrated or intrinsically present in all of these other facets of practice and meditation. And that will be an opportunity for us to revisit that, to inspire ourselves for deeper levels of practice if we feel connected to those, or at least to consider whether we might want to one day approach those. There's certainly a lot of material to rely on and to be inspired by when we address that topic. So that's going to happen next weekend. And this class is the last class in the main sequence. And it's the last class in that we're going to be using our usual format of doing a preliminary meditation, then doing a check-in, and so forth for the last time. And then discussing the material for this week, which is the topic of equanimity, revisiting that, trying to understand that more deeply, then talking about the four immeasurables as a synergetic system where we can use them to deal more gracefully with the different types of situations that arise in our life, and where we can use the four immeasurables to balance each other, to establish a truly balanced state of benevolence, where none of the four immeasurables, transforms into a false facsimile of it. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll also briefly talk about the progression from the four immeasurables to the so-called great levels of loving kindness, compassion, and so on, to the quality of so-called bodhicitta, which is a very important facet of these practices in the Tibetan tradition. And we'll briefly talk about the practice of giving and taking, which is a very currently popular practice for cultivating compassion and loving kindness, but historically is actually an incredibly powerful method for cultivating not just love and compassion, but also profound levels of enlightened altruism. And that is, in some systems, is taught as a full path to awakening, a practice that can encompass all the different facets of our life and completely transform our being. So we'll mention that at the end, and if there's enough time, we'll rest with that practice, we'll experiment with it at least a tiny bit, and then we'll conclude with some beautiful aspirations, which are traditionally used to strengthen both compassion and loving kindness. So that's the plan. I'm very grateful to be here with all of you once again, and I'm very grateful that we've been able to do this course, that we've been able to have 10 meetings, all devoted to cultivating the most beautiful qualities of our heart and mind that might be available to us. And even as we see our own limitations, even when we come across some blocks in our minds, even when we see that we have not been entirely successful at acting compassionately or lovingly or wisely and so forth, we know that these four qualities are part of our basic goodness, and we can always tap into them, we can always access them, we can always continue uncovering them step by step. And part of that is done on the cushion, the other part is done in daily life, and it's a never-ending creative process in a way. The only end for it is finding the ultimate fruition and ultimate flourishing of these qualities. But until then, we'll keep working with them in one way or another. And to find a firm foundation for that, we practice equanimity. So that's what we'll turn to now once again, starting with settling our body, speech, and mind, and then doing an equanimity meditation in the Sanskrit style that we have been using. So for that, please find a comfortable stationary position. And then spend a little bit of time releasing physical tension and finding mental ease by perhaps observing the breath and allowing it to flow naturally. To establish a more firm foundation of relaxation, stability, and clarity, relaxation, stillness, and vigilance, we might do an abbreviated body scan where we first revisit our feet and toes, bringing awareness to the muscles in this area and releasing physical tension. Then spending some time with our pelvic floor and the muscles around it. Once again, being aware and releasing tension. Then deeply relaxing our hands and fingers and noticing the stillness present in them when we release all types of movement. And then our shoulders, once again, relaxing, releasing, finding ease. And finally, our face, all the facial muscles, the sensations in them, attending to this part of the body and finding stillness, finding relaxation and not losing vigilance. And then, with our body resting in this state, generating a positive motivation for the ensuing practice of equanimity and for our entire session together by revisiting our highest aspirations, as we always do. And then with that motivation as the basis, turning to the analytical element of equanimity practice by first imagining three people in front of us, someone we consider a friend or a loved one, someone who to us appears as a neutral person, stranger, an object of relative indifference, and then someone we feel antagonistic towards, a so-called enemy, basically a person we're not entirely comfortable with for whatever reason. Imagining these three people in front of us and resting in the awareness of the fact that they all are subjects of their experiences, they all have their own lives, they feel pain, they feel joy. Their experience is a complex mixture of different types of events, feelings, aspirations, wishes, dreams. But from our side, we consider them to be quite different. So we ask ourselves, why is it that I see this first person as a friend, this second person as a stranger, an object of indifference, and finally this third person, an enemy? Why do I put them into these three categories? Is it something inherently present from their own side that is the reason? And then we look into the subjective, projected nature of these categories, how they arise, how they come to be in our mind, and how we reify them, and how we then consider our friends to be worthy of love, compassion, happiness, freedom from suffering, all types of joy. How we feel indifference towards so-called strangers, and how for our enemies, we might even feel certain levels of malice, or at least such feelings as fear, I wish to avoid, and so forth. How does this complex interplay of conceptual labels, feelings, emotions, how does this come to be? And then, how would a truly realized practitioner, a genuine yogini or yogi, see these beings and ourselves? What would their less conditioned perception see? not this childish conceptual framework of inherently existent friends, strangers, and enemies, but for beings who want to be happy and free from suffering, for beings endowed with basic goodness, for beings who, due to their impermanent nature, might change, might cultivate the causes of happiness, might eliminate the causes of suffering. So we can try that type of perception on for ourselves, trying to now attend to these three beings, and by extension also to ourselves, with warm-hearted, caring awareness. Then extending that open-hearted, warm awareness that cares without attending to the three categories, without reifying those. Extending this caring awareness to all beings. Equanimously embracing everyone with care. Not yet loving kindness, not yet compassion, not yet empathetic joy, but the underlying equanimous, open care. And then if we wish to add the additional aspirational element that is sometimes described in the Tibetan tradition, we can also wish for all beings to possess this type of equanimity, genuine open-heartedness. And then releasing these aspirations, images, thoughts, feelings to rest in open clarity. Then dedicating the energy of this meditation by once again revisiting our highest aspirations. And then coming back to our body to introduce some movement to it by rocking back and forth, moving our hands and fingers, And slowly concluding this practice as we return to our shared online space. Thank you. Thank you for joining me in this meditation. And this would be the perfect time for our check-in, of course, because it largely revolves around the practice of equanimity and any potential questions or challenges or victories or delights that might have arisen while we have been practicing with it. So 2 questions here on the slide. What was your practice experience over these 7 days? Knowing that many of us probably experimented with equanimity quite a while. And then how easy was it to cultivate and maintain equanimity as this open-hearted attitude towards beings? Some people might have experimented with the Pali understanding of equanimity, that is giving being space. That is also, of course, absolutely fine. But for this course, as I mentioned, we primarily rely on the Sanskrit tradition and its texts and quotes from it and different practice elements of it. And that's why we just did the practice with the 3 categories, saying through them and then resting in open-hearted warmth. So anything that might have come up, I'll just patiently wait for it, just as I always do. And we'll see what comes up in the chat. As always, feel free to either message the entire group or send something to me privately so that I can read it out without mentioning your name. Either way is fine. The first observation here, I found it easy to maintain equanimity when meditating or thinking, but it was much more difficult when interacting with people who triggered emotional responses in me. And that's, of course, the essence of our challenge here. We cultivate equanimity cognitively, as in on the cushion in meditation, in mental exercises and mental experiments in our thinking and so forth. And then slowly, we also bring it to the behavioral level. And that includes the level of our interactions with others. But this is where it's helpful to, at least on occasion, at least gently, at least in small ways, remind ourselves of open-heartedness, of caring, of warmth. And even though that might not immediately change our experience in large ways, even a gentle reminder of that nature slowly would help us release some of the knots in our relationships with others, including our momentary interactions. And that would overall, in the long term, change the entire fabric of our life. And not just of our life, but of course also of the society in which we exist and to which we contribute our energy of the 4 immeasurables or our energy of anger and so forth. So slowly moving towards that by adding these small reminders and being gentle with ourselves in this process. I did the equanimity practice and found it easy to do for the two first categories, but when it came to an enemy, I had a lot of resistance. I first chose a former political figure, could not summon up any feeling of worth or understanding for him. So I changed to someone less of an enemy. It was a lot easier. Yeah, it does absolutely make sense to start with people who we might find it more easy to deal with. And yet at the same time, in the Tibetan tradition, there is also an opposite approach that's sometimes described. It's not for everybody, this opposite approach. It's not necessarily for all of us to use, but that approach includes cultivating compassion in a way where we start by the most atrocious figure we could think of. That's our first object. And of course, the logic there is that once we break through that very big obstacle of all the displeasure we might have for them, all the hatred, all the fear, essentially all the negative feelings and attitudes, once we break through once we go through that, through those obstacles, we break through them and we attain genuine compassion, we're able to cultivate genuine compassion. Any other object by comparison would be easier to tackle. Well, how do we succeed in that method? Of course, it needs a certain level of wisdom, because we need to see how all the bad things, quote unquote, bad things that people do, they do not just under the influence of previous trauma in a way, which is also true, but not only on the basis of bad things that have happened to them in this life. It's that, of course, absolutely, but not just that. Beyond that, it's also the primordial delusions that we have, a primordial misunderstanding of how we exist, how others exist, a misunderstanding of interdependence, not seeing how the causes we create lead to results and so forth. All of that confusion, all of that inner pain, all of that desire for happiness, misguided desire for happiness, all of that combines into creating this person that we see, that we perceive, that we judge. And it's fine to have moral judgment towards things that they do, absolutely. It's absolutely necessary even. But for these practices to be successful, and that includes equanimity of this kind, we need to penetrate through the outer facade to the vulnerable core in a way, and see that because this core is vulnerable and it seeks happiness, but it's misguided, it's confused, that's why the things that we judge happen. And having that skill of removing cognitive fusion, removing the fusion between the person and the deeds, knowing that the deeds are absolutely not okay, but this person at their core just wants to be safe, just wants to be happy, just wants to be joyful, just wants to be free. Seeing that, not falling into that cognitive fusion would actually in very large ways help us treat ourselves nicely and be kind and compassionate for ourselves, because we would be in situations in our life where we feel somewhat disgusted by ourselves, for example, or not too comfortable with ourselves, because there is that fusion happening. We fuse our sense of worth with something that we did that was not too good, that was regrettable, or we fuse our sense of worth with self-worth, with, for example, the way our body looks, or with different things related to social expectations, such as our social status, the amount of money we earn, and so forth. All of those sorts of things can become a reason for why we feel bad about ourselves. But where we're able to avoid that fusion and see, hey, these things need to be considered, these things need to be dealt with, but that doesn't remove my right to be happy, especially eudaimonically happy. None of that removes simply my right, in a way, to be free from suffering, and so forth. When we see that, it makes it so much easier to rest in self-compassion, self-care, self-kindness, and so forth. So the same skill of avoiding cognitive fusion applied here to an enemy, or applied in this radical practice that I've described to the biggest enemy we could think of. And the more common approach, yes, is to start with smaller enemies, people we're less uncomfortable with, and slowly grow those muscles until we can get to a person that's really obnoxious in our perception. That's absolutely correct as well. But I wanted to mention this alternative approach and the essence of it, which is avoiding cognitive fusion. This week, irony of practicing equanimity. Being of service in a high stress and going situation, equanimity and compassion have really carried me through the situation. The meditations have really helped. Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful, because that's what they're they're for. So when they can hold us, these practices and the qualities themselves, then we can feel joyful and content. It was, next observation, it was powerful to feel for myself how much easier it felt to show equanimity towards strangers and even enemies compared to some of my closest loved ones that I think I most care about, but who have the most impact on my life in small and big ways. The exercise of reminding myself that everyone is seeking happiness and freedom from suffering was really helpful. It gave me the space to reestablish the autonomy of my loved ones and to acknowledge their position as subject, not object. Thank you. Absolutely true. That is why equanimity is the antidote, is one of the antidotes for the false facsimile of loving kindness, which is that grasping desire trying to control primarily our loved ones, not so much strangers and let alone enemies, but primarily our loved ones. So it's said that when our loving kindness seems to degenerate into that state, we need equanimity. And that can mean equanimity in the Pali sense of the word, where we use the practice described by some masters of the Pali tradition, and we think about all beings exist within their own nexus of causes and conditions. They're on their own path in a way. So they don't have to live up to my expectations of them. That's one approach. And the other approach is the one that we've been using with the Sanskrit tradition, where we say, hey, well, you're not inherently mine. Nothing in your body, nothing in your mind makes you mine. You're not mine. You are in a certain relationship with me, but that shifts and change, and certainly not going to be helped by my attempts at smothering you or controlling you and so forth. You are a subject, exactly as you've said in this observation, noticing the fact that they are subjects. Each being is a subject to its own experiences is a very helpful antidote here. Absolutely. It's a general question about, next observation, it's a general question about meditation practice. I have a strong rumination tendency that instead of getting better seems to get worse with years of meditation. For example, in a 24-minute meditation, I have to return to the meditation object dozens of times. I suppose it has to do with samsara, which is being very hard at the local and international level. Anyway, maybe you're doing something, you're doing something wrong. I appreciate your advice. Well, sometimes they say that when it seems to us that we're getting distracted more, it's actually that we're noticing the distractions more. So that's one possibility. We might just be noticing the distractions more, which is good. And every time we notice a distraction, we release it and we return to the object. That's one consideration. Another consideration is that, just as you've said, when times are very difficult, we would be getting distracted more because there's so many problems around us on the international level, on the local level, in our personal life as well, that not getting sucked into thoughts about those might be difficult. So then it's our responsibility in a way, or our creative challenge, to find a shamatha practice, or generally a practice that is most soothing to us and thus helps us get distracted a bit less. So, of course, as we know, in general, the Buddha prescribed mindfulness of breathing as an antidote for rumination. And yet, if we're practicing mindfulness of breathing and we're seeing that doesn't seem to help me that much, well, if we've practiced it for a long time and we're not seeing improvement, it might be worthwhile to check out another method that might be more engaging in our perception. The Pali tradition talks about different personality types, and then depending on our personality type, we might choose this method or that method. And I'm not going to go into that because a lot of these methods are not even practiced today anymore, neither in the Pali tradition or in the Sanskrit tradition. So it's not to make, not to say that everyone needs to find the chart and check out what works for you and then work with that. Not that. What I'm saying is we can check for ourselves whether, for example, loving kindness helps us hold our attention on the object through the medium of phrases and so forth a little bit more strongly than mindfulness of breathing does. Or to go to the a different dimension, maybe It's more embodied awareness, focusing on the sensations in the body that are not simply the breath, just focusing on the sensations on the body, throughout the body, or in our palms, or in our feet, just resting with that with a lot of ease. Rumination does seem to grow when we're getting frustrated about it in meditation. So if we're getting distracted and then we're starting to get frustrated about that, that will only feed that mental energy, especially if we direct that frustration towards ourselves, as, oh, you can't do this, nothing works. That level of sort of irritation just makes the mind even more unsettled. And instead, we might practice the qualities of contentment. Okay, if I have to return 500 times, that's good enough. It's training. The quality of contentment as in, oh, I'm working with my breath, and every mindful breath, every mindful cycle of breathing is soothing, is healing, is transformative. That's good. Or every time I re-establish the aspirational loving kindness, or every moment I spend in observing the sensations of the body and so forth. Every moment of mindful awareness is healing in a way. So we could do that. And we could even generate some excitement about each opportunity to come back to the object again and again and again, starting anew, starting afresh, finding this fresh beginning. And not being frustrated by that is a large part as well, but not to say, oh, I need to cut frustration, need to remove it from my mind. That's not how it works. We just switch, we just move our attention to more wholesome mode, which might be one of these things that I've just described. And slowly, slowly, with a lot of gentle, caring work, results might emerge. And they don't emerge outside of the general context in which we're practicing. And that includes our diet and our sleep and our outer situation and the international situation and the room we're meditating in, and how we, in the beginning, fine-tune our mind by saying, hey, for the duration of this practice, I'm just going to focus on healing my body and mind, not so much on what's going on in the rest of my life, and so forth. All of those things matter. Realizing how reliant I am on needing approval from the next observation, realizing how reliant I am on needing approval from others, this practice helped me to see this. When able to truly apply equanimity, if only briefly, a feeling of peacefulness seems to pervade my being. Very grateful. That's a beautiful observation, and that's a beautiful thing to discover, because indeed, not just with equanimity, but with all of these states, when we briefly are able to connect with any type of spacious, warm-hearted awareness, and that can be loving kindness, that can be equanimity, that can be just radiant clarity infused with a certain element of caring, and so forth. Because we come in touch with our basic goodness, and basic goodness does not need approval, we sort of experience a moment of liberation right there, liberation from that concern, at least, that worldly concern, as it's sometimes described in Buddhism. And that's powerful. It's a very powerful thing to experience. We then return to our sort of normal conditioned awareness, where we are still working, we are still operating with the same habits of seeking approval, trying to win approval, giving approval, not giving approval, and so forth. But over time, those habits might slowly become less prevalent, less obvious. We establish a greater level of confidence in ourselves, in our Buddha nature, and our basic goodness. And that's truly transformative. So slowly, that would get stronger, and the need for approval would become less obvious. Even if it doesn't disappear anytime soon, that's one of the most complicated, the most difficult things to completely let go of. Infusing the equation of seeking approval with this level of grace and dignity and lightheartedness is a wonderful thing, and a very transformative thing for this. I experienced this differently today. I was neutral with a stranger and someone that causes pain. With a loved one, the word betrayal came up. When you ask what an observer would see, it grounded me into the fact that we're all human beings, and that I cannot hide behind my projections for any human. It is up to me to love myself and have an open heart for myself, so I can love others openly. Not sure if that makes sense. It does absolutely make sense. Yes, we are stuck in tunnel vision, and we hide behind that tunnel vision to justify our feelings in large ways and small ways. And some of those feelings, quite interestingly, are culturally conditioned and would not even exist in another culture. Some types of romantic feelings, some types of jealousy, some types of envy, some types of even grasping at our material possessions. In some cultures where all possessions are in the ownership of the tribe, we would not be saying, hey, how dare you take my Game Boy and take my book or whatever. So there's a lot of layers that come into experiencing these emotions and these feelings, and into us constructing and reifying those projections. And yet, even for a moment, to imagine, what would a realized being see? And we can't maybe yet conceptualize or even feel or especially experience directly how would they see the ultimate reality, the emptiness of it all, and so forth. But that's not what we're thinking about in this practice either. Just the basic beingness, the basic wish to be free, to be happy, and how we are a mixture of things. Even imagining seeing that is a wonderful change. And there's another type of practice related to this called equalizing self and other, which is a slightly different method. But within that, we would also be considering how, well, in some cases we feel, oh, these beings, they betrayed me and they did this and they did that. But then really, were we to be very honest with ourselves, we would see that we've done a lot of similar things, if not to the same degree, but there is some similarity in what we've done, if not to this person, then to other people. As in, we all lied about things. In some cases, we keep lying, and that's a habit that's hard to deal with. And we've harmed the bodies of others, at least indirectly. We've sat on mosquitoes, we've stepped on cockroaches by accident, and so forth. And so forth. And not always have we been very skillful in using our sexual energy and our ability to be attractive to others and so forth, or our desire for others. Not always have we talked about others only kindly and compassionately and so forth. And realizing that is not meant to make us feel worse. It's meant to see, it's meant to help us see, yes, we are all human. And there's grace, there's dignity in understanding that and bringing it to the equation. And it's also, I just want to add this perhaps, because I get sort of emotional talking about these things, because I think they're at the heart of our existence as human beings. Our tenderness, our vulnerability, our ability to be graceful with each other, our kindness, our equanimity, all these sorts of things. And so hard to do and so vital. So my tiny addition to this is sometimes when we look at the context of our life, when we consider all of these things, we feel like crying, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with feeling like crying. There's also nothing wrong with crying at all, because it sort of in a way makes us softer and removes some of the blocks and emotional blocks and some of the actually traumatic energy from our body in a way. So yeah, deep stuff, all of this. Whilst on retreat last week, whenever I went into judgment around a person, I was reminded of how to maintain equanimity by the retreat guide when that person was disturbed and disturbing to the group through the example of understanding their suffering, creating connection. I was reminded of equanimity as a more natural position rather than my oppositional judgment. It also happened for me when in my judgment there was too much noise talking. The retreat guide just gently asked us to maintain our intention for a spacious silence. That's beautiful as well. And I think one thing I'm reminded of over the last bit is that this might seem like a bit of a facetious Buddhist. Actually, Christian tradition says that as well, mystical Christian tradition. but like a facetious observation that is not always applicable and not always skillful, but sometimes it is, and that is to say, well, the only true silence is our inner silence. And our challenge is to cultivate the inner silence that would be with us, to connect to our inner silence, even when we are in the midst of a Madonna concert or whatever it is, a Glastonbury festival. Whenever we are in a large crowd, not losing the connection to that. And that I'm reminded of that because recently a friend of mine who's an artist did some nude drawings that they put up on their social media profile, and some people started complaining, oh, how dare you, you're Buddhist, how dare you put up nude paintings? And another friend facetiously said, well, if your mind is polluted with desire and so forth, then removing outer nude pictures would not help. But were the mind to be free of the afflictions, even if there's 1,000 billion nude paintings or drawings or whatever, that would make a difference. Who cares? Nothing wrong with it. So that's in a way where some of our judgments spring from. And that statement only has, or these sorts of ideas and jokes only have conditional applicability, because we can't apply them to, and we shouldn't apply them to, issues of systemic injustice and so forth. Those things need to be properly tackled. But sometimes it's helpful to tell us, oh, well, my challenge now is to connect to my inner silence. And now no one can take that from me. And then, of course, when it is within our hands to fix the container of the retreat, to adjust things and so forth, we do that with an open heart. I thought I was doing well with equanimity in my meditation practice, but unfortunately, I had an encounter with a stranger which totally destroyed any equanimity I was attempting to bring to this encounter. This encounter brought forth so many negative emotions in myself, and the strength of these emotions were a total surprise to me. So during my meditation, I added this person as the enemy. I attempted to get through my negative feelings that arose due to this unfortunate encounter. This person continues to be included in my meditation for the past few days as I work on my negative emotions that continue to persist. I'm also aware that I need to be kind to myself, and the encounter has emphasized to me how much work I need to do. Well, yes, that last bit is the beginning point. When we see that our body and mind have become overactivated, we go back to soothing these body and mind, projecting loving kindness and compassion, or connecting to our foundational quality of tenderness and so forth. So the remedial work first, in a way, and that in itself does not in any way disconnect it from others. This person, it only exists within the larger network of all the other people, including the person that potentially disturbed us. So by soothing this person, we're already establishing positive interdependence for the other person as well. But then, of course, there is benefit in actively attending to the other person and taking our time with it and moving slowly and being gentle with ourselves, and knowing that some situations are so complex, they require a lot of care or therapeutic attention or mediation, or just a lot of time that would heal the wounds, or a lot of distance, and so forth. And that is not something that the Tibetan tradition would be unaware of, because in the Tibetan tradition, there are practices specifically for example, healing grudges. And I'm not going to describe them because they boil down to what we are practicing here anyway, except sometimes they also use visualizations and mantras and so forth, which is not the style that we're following in this course. But this is just to say that, yes, even the great Tibetan masters with their level of practice, and the great Indian masters who were at the root of all of this, knew that healing a grudge is a very complex thing to do, or healing from, or processing complicated feelings is a big thing to do. And yet we know what to do. We know to apply wisdom and compassion, as in wisdom and all the four immeasurables, and slowly, slowly, the knot will undo itself. And the final observation here, St. John of the Cross said that God's first language was silence. Yeah, a beautiful, beautiful observation, beautiful thought. And of course, when we do one of the styles for settling body, speech, and mind, we very actively attend to silence, the silence beyond and behind our thoughts, so our inner speech, and behind and beyond the outer sounds that we hear, and so forth. And actually, in all styles of settling body, speech, and mind, we allow our speech to be silent, but sometimes we also listen to this inner silence. And in a way, that in itself is a whole meditation practice, actually. Underlying any other practice or any other method that we might do. So now let's briefly revisit equanimity, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll continue by talking about balancing the 4 measurables. But first, for equanimity. So we talked about equanimity as this basic mental state or attitude that is free from neurotic types of attachment, aversion, and indifference. And we said that in terms of practice, there are multiple interpretations of it, or multiple approaches that we could follow. One of the main ones that we could find in the Pali tradition, it's not the only one, but one of the major ones, there has to do with seeing that all beings inherit the results of their own actions, as in we all have essentially our own karmic path or our own system of causes and conditions and results. So we can't really control what happens to other beings. They are subjects to their own experience, but also their entire existence is a machine where there are specific systems of causality at play. And although we can add elements to their causality, we can, from our side, offer help, offer advice when asked for, offer loving kindness, offer compassion, create systems of support, and so on. Although we could do that, that doesn't mean people would choose or can choose to use our help, for example. Everyone's trying to do the best they can, given the information, the mental space they have, and so forth, the resources that they have, inner and outer. So we might be reaching out our hand for what to us appears to be a long time, and the beings are not taking it. And then we feel indignant. We feel like, why don't you accept my help? Why are you still doing what you think is best, and so forth? And that's the opposite of this type of equanimity. Whereas in reality, we might just give being space in a way, which does not mean also removing ourselves from their lives, unless that's what's necessary for our own survival and well-being and mental health and safety and so forth. But we're certainly never removing others from our heart. We're equanimously holding them there. And that type of spaciousness is equanimity, as described in the Pali tradition. And then for the Sanskrit tradition, we're working with the 3 categories. And then having worked with them, we are cultivating this willingness to equally care for all beings. That is, all those we label as friends, all those we label as strangers, all those we label as enemies. And then in addition, the additional element that we also used might mean that we're also wishing for all these beings themselves to possess and to cultivate and to experience impartiality or equanimity, this freedom from bias, equal caring that is free from bias, that does not exclude anyone from the overall field care. And Jigme Lingpa in this case, Jigme Lingpa with regards to this says, impartiality is freedom from attachment and hostility. So as we've said, an attitude that is free, balanced in that it is free from neurotic types of desire towards beings, aversion towards beings, indifferent towards beings. When sides and factions are all seen as equal, when enemy and friend in neither, that is neutral person, all are treated with an even-handed kindness. So that basic care, that basic tenderness extends equally to all. And that does not remove social conventions. We do need to take care of our children. We do need to take care of our communities. And also we need global thinking in this day and age because, hello, climate change and so forth. But Global thinking, once again, does not remove the ability to see local customs and conventions, which are very important actually in teachings for aspiring Buddhists, in teachings for bodhisattvas. And that's what we start with. So a beautiful quote from Jigme Lingpa, beautifully translated here by the Padmakara Translation Committee. Let's take a 5-minute bio break to take care of our body and mind a little bit, to move around, drink some water, and maybe actually do the bathroom business. And then in 5 minutes from now, we'll return to talk about balancing the 4 immeasurables and cultivating their greater form, which is the 4 greats, so-called. And then we'll talk about giving and taking. So please enjoy a break. We'll see each other in 5 minutes. So let's continue. We have a little bit more to cover, and I'm very deeply grateful for everything that you've shared. I did mention that. I think every time we're doing this sharing, and we've done this sharing, and I hope that if we ever organize more courses, online retreats, in-person retreats, we ever revisit these practices, or we recompile the material and talk about other things such as Eco-Dharma, which is another thing that I'm very passionate about, and so forth. And every time we share anything about these things, it's very impactful for me personally, actually, I should say, because this is, as I've said, this is powerful stuff. This is people talking about the very core of how they treat themselves and others, the very core of how they feel about their life. And I find a lot of inspiration in this, and a lot of passion, a lot of joy in this type of work, because I've also been a Buddhist translator for many years now, and I've served as an interpreter for events where, for example, people would be taught practice that involves visualizations and mantras and so forth, and those can be incredibly transformative if done properly, but the discussions in those classes would largely revolve around how to visualize this thing, what's the symbolism of that, how to do this element, what's the meaning of this mantra, and so forth. And that's just clarifying the details of practice. Nothing wrong with that at all, but it's not as deeply intimate as talking about how we treat ourselves, right? And in some ways, it's not as transformative if we fall into the so-called spiritual bypass when we use those methods. Ideally, we don't. And that's why you would find that actually, and that's directly relevant, amongst the elderly Tibetans and beyond Tibetans, the elderly Himalayan Buddhists, but also that includes Mongolian Buddhists and Buddhists of the 3 Mongolian tribes in Russia and so forth. When you see the elderly practitioners, and sometimes younger practitioners as well, but quite often elderly practitioners, spending their days just reciting a lot of Om Mani Padme Hum mantra, which is the mantra of compassion, just focusing compassionately on all beings, repeating this simple verbal formula to pray for the benefit of all beings and the freedom of all beings, and then do that hundreds of thousands of times and millions of times. And some elderly people accumulate 100 million repetitions of this mantra. Some accumulate many sets of 100 million repetitions of it. Some do the mantra 50,000 times a day and so forth. This is a lot of practice, incredible amount of practice, actually. And then you see how they treat, for example, an insect they come across. One thing that I remember very, very vividly was that one of the first times I was visiting Dharamsala, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama lives in exile, there's a relatively small temple there, immediately adjacent to the Dalai Lama's residence. So that's the official temple. It was the first big temple, ceremonial temple that Tibetans constructed there. And since then, many much bigger temples have been erected in Nepal and in other parts of India and so forth. But that relatively small temple is still the temple where the Dalai Lama gives most of his teachings. It's quite small, quite simple, not rich. It's not a rich monastery, by the way, in any capacity. And then you would see there's just a few, always there's a few elderly Tibetans doing the circumambulations there because they live in Dharamsala. They've spent their entire life working very hard. Now they're being taken care of by their family, and they just do some mantras, they practice, they drink tea, they look at the mountains, they try to pass on their stories of old Tibet to the next generation. And the stories are getting lost, by the way, at an incredibly alarming pace. But then you would see, and that's what I saw, there was a ladybug just plomping along, la-di-da-di-da, going about its business, and an elderly Tibetan woman who bent down, picked up the ladybug because it was in danger of being crushed, unaware of the danger somehow. She picked it up, said some Om Mani Padme Hum mantras to it, therefore supercharging the ladybug itself with compassion, blessing it, so that in its future life, ladybug itself can be reborn as a practitioner of the same mantra and also attain awakening as the Buddha of compassion in the future. So she blessed it, and then she let it go. Very simple thing, completely natural, spontaneous. It was not a result of a 10-part course, you know, and it was not a thing where she had to, oh, yeah, probably should. It's just a spontaneous act. And that it looked very spontaneous. And that was so powerfully inspiring. And of course, many people don't need mantras to do that. They already have that spontaneous compassion. And many people strengthen their compassion through these meditations that we're doing here, or these mantras or related methods and so forth. And that is one of the most beautiful and powerful things to witness, to get inspired by, to find hope in these dark times. As we see, hey, at the core of human beings, at the core of mammals, actually at the core of all sentient beings, by extension, there is this core of compassion and wisdom, and that can be accessed. And that's what gives us hope, even as we are experiencing wars and climate catastrophes and so forth. So that's what Mathieu Ricard talks about so brilliantly and with a lot of scientific references in his book, Altruism, that I've mentioned before. And that's one of our recommended readings for this course, which we will send out after this class. But now coming back to the four immeasurables as a set. So ideally, we practice them as a set. That does not mean that every day we need to meditate on all the four immeasurables. What it means is that over time, as we go through life, we spend a bit of time here cultivating compassion, then we attend more to loving kindness, we do a little bit of practice of joy, or we do a lot of practice of joy. As I've mentioned, joy, empathetic joy is often the sort of neglected one, the unsung hero of the four immeasurables. And of course, since we can combine it with rejoicing, which is practiced in the Tibetan tradition much more often. Rejoicing is done by many practitioners, at least daily, not multiple times a day, but because it's part of a foundational prayer that's done by most Tibetan Buddhists. Rejoicing is done a lot, but empathetic joy kind of sometimes is a bit neglected, so maybe we do a lot of it. What could be better than being joyful and resting in joy? And then, of course, equanimity is the foundation of that. So that's how they work as a set. Even if we were doing a retreat on the four immeasurables, we wouldn't just divide the day into four. We could, but most people wouldn't. I would not. That would not be my recommendation. We would not just divide the day into 4 sessions and spend some time meditating on all the four immeasurables. Usually, we would work primarily with one, and then maybe add a little bit of one of the others on the side, slowly. And we could, in long installments, shift focus. We could spend a few weeks on this one, then switch our primary focus to the next one, and so forth. And there are other considerations for long-term retreats like that we could, in the future, explore together. But in general, we would be primarily focusing on one, sometimes exploring another, and so forth. However, we eventually acquire a certain mastery of these, and then they can become our natural response, our learned natural response to the 3 types of situations we encounter in life. And in this classification, from a Buddhist point of view, there are only 3 types of situations that we can encounter in life. There are situations that are sort of neutral, sort of okay-ish, not perfect. We're not blissing out, but we're also not suffering horribly. We're not dying from heartbreak. We're not suffering from strong physical pain. Just, business as usual, okay-ish. Then suffering, and that can be mental anguish, that can be physical suffering, that can be very strong depression, that can be very strong anxiety, which is painful, very strong jealousy, very painful experience. a complex of emotions, and so forth. So moments of suffering. And of course, suffering related to outer situations, war, catastrophe, being in a car accident, losing a loved one, and so forth. Of course, sources of suffering. So all that. And then there are joyful moments. We won the lottery, we just had very nice lunch with our friends. We just did a beautiful outing. We are enjoying the beauty of nature. We went to the majestic hills of Wales and we're just looking at how beautiful they look. And so forth. So many beautiful things and experiences in our life. And even small joys of having a nice matcha ice cream, if that's the kind of thing you enjoy, or a nice cup of tea. Beautiful, small moments of joy. So 3 situations: happy, unhappy, neutral, essentially. Hard to argue with that logic, and then it's actually substantiated in the Buddhist tradition, where we talk about a specific mental function called feeling, which is basically the tone of every experience that we have. It's always somewhere on the spectrum between incredibly blissful and incredibly painful. And in the middle is some kind of neutrality there. So that's sort of how our mind operates at all times. Every moment of being alive feels like something, feels pleasant, unpleasant, to neutral, somewhere on that spectrum. And it's a very large spectrum. We can be incredibly blissful, and people like to go for those experiences, either physical or mental, chemically induced, physically induced, coming from meditation, coming from suggestion, so many different ways to bliss out, right? And then suffering, that's usually something that we try to avoid, but not always possible, not always easy. And then sort of the neutral, which is where most people who are not, for instance, very deeply depressed, not very strongly anxious in this moment, find themselves a lot of the time. Kind of okayish. How are you? I'm okay, unless we're lying in that moment, that's kind of the neutral situation that we're talking about here. Well, the response to the neutral situation would be loving kindness. Why? Loving kindness sees the potential for greater well-being. It sees promise in the thing that we are. It sees promise in our life. Oh, looks promising. There's greater happiness to be obtained. Yes, greater levels of balanced, dignified hedonia, and of course, greater eudaimonic well-being that we could cultivate. That one can be cultivated even in extreme conditions in some cases. But normally, of course, instead of telling people, oh, even if you're poor and hungry, you should meditate, and that's what life is all about, instead of being obnoxious and insensitive like that, we do try to establish dignified levels of hedonia for everyone involved, and then also provide them with resources for eudaimonic cultivation. So loving kindness sees the potential for those greater types of happiness, and it inspires us to pursue those, to go after those, especially eudaimonic well-being, but of course also hedonic in a balanced way, and so forth. Instead of simply resting with this neutrality, we're going after happiness, slowly, slowly. Then there are moments of distress, suffering, brokenheartedness, anguish, pain, sometimes physical pain, sometimes incredible physical pain, and sometimes just mild discomfort of having a headache, or seeing that someone did not live up to their promise, but it's not a really big deal for us, but kind of unpleasant, and kind of, we can't say it ruined our day, but it certainly did not make our day any better. Those sorts of experiences. So once again, there's a whole spectrum of suffering. Well, the response there is compassion. May I be free from this suffering, from the causes of suffering. And that additional part, especially strongly emphasized in the Tibetan tradition, reminds us, well, this did not arise out of nowhere. There's multiple causes and conditions involved in this, including those from the side of our mind. So if we are feeling disappointed, it might be true that other people let us down. Conventionally speaking, there is such a thing as betrayal. Absolutely. Conventionally, we can agree on what that means, and we can start using that term, and we would have emotions about it. So that absolutely no denial of that. There are also norms of behavior accepted within our society, things that are dignified, not dignified, all those sorts of things. So no denial of that, but we also can remind ourselves that, well, what does it say? Expectations are just premeditated disappointments, I think, something like that. And that is, well, we did have an expectation. And not only that, we also have a habit, an emotional habit of feeling strongly disappointed when someone does not live up to what they say they would. And were we to have greater sort of level situational equanimity there, we would have greater, were our touch to be lighter there, our mind would have reacted perhaps differently. And that is not to put the entire responsibility just on us. There is also the interaction. That's very important. But there is some level of freedom that we have in slowly over time, adjusting our expectations, our emotional habits, our responses, and so forth. And we're reminded of that when we think about the causes of suffering. Some causes of suffering we have control over. So let's work with those with gentleness and ease. And then an observation here, Jonathan Swift said, expect nothing and you will never be disappointed. Yes, that's a very tall order, of course. Probably the only beings that never expect anything at all are fully awakened ones, but slowly we can move towards that. And even a reminder helps us find that lightness of touch. Once again, I'm reminded of that analogy that I gave, that Mingyur Rinpoche sometimes presents, that is, were we to hold our mala like this in a tight fist through tension, we would get exhausted quite fast. Whereas were it to rest with ease on our palm, were we to hold it without too strong of a grasping, then that would be much easier on our fingers for sure. So with the same idea, we still do need to keep in touch with our life, but not to smother it, or ourselves really. But that takes time to cultivate. And yet we can wish for ourselves to have that freedom, and that's compassion. Then when there's joy, we can empathize with that, and we can be joyful about the joy. And we can wish for all beings to share and partake of that joy and greater joy up until the joy of full awakening, perhaps, the greatest eudaimonic well-being possible. So that's empathetic joy would be a nice response to all types of delight. And then equanimity towards situations, which we briefly talked about last time, slightly different from equanimity towards towards beings, is the foundation for all these balanced responses. Well, cultivating equanimity towards situations is not always an easy task, but that's something that we move towards through all of these practices of kindness and compassion and loving kindness and so forth. So this whole side, and also practices of mental stability, so brilliantly described in the first 3 chapters of the 4 Immeasurables book by Dr. Alan Wallace, and also wisdom. Wisdom is the topic of the last chapter of that same book, but of course, beyond that, we need many more teachings on the practices of wisdom. And for those, we master different types of insight meditations and on impermanence and interdependence and emptiness and so many other things that we can analyze and understand with greater cognitive clarity. However, we also can respond in this way to other beings. So when we see beings that are feeling okay-ish, we can respond with loving kindness. When our friends or maybe some strangers or even enemies are suffering, we can respond with compassion. And when we see beings experiencing wholesome joy, such as having a nice cup of tea and enjoying it, we can experience empathetic joy. As simple as that. And then, of course, for others, we need the equanimity that we've been working on, the equanimity towards beings. When we have that, it would be easy for us to start responding to all beings who are neutral in their experience with loving kindness, to suffering beings with compassion, and to beings who are joyful with empathetic joy. As simple as that. So in a way, this is everything we need for emotional intelligence or emotional balance. Beyond that, of course, so many other helpful skills to cultivate, because, well, just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. Just because this system sort of covers the entirety of emotional intelligence and also truly ethical behavior in a way also stems from this, even though it does need fine-tuning and greater levels of clarity. just because it's so simple doesn't mean it's easy to realize, which is why we use all the additional science and skills and knowledge and understanding and such methods as cultivating emotional balance, and we read texts on emotions and so forth to strengthen our inner immune system, as Dr. Alan Wallace sometimes describes it. Our inner immune system that protects our mind from afflictive mental states. To strengthen it, we use a variety of tools, but in a way where we're to just focus on the 4 immeasurables, supporting them with the practices of samadhi, or cultivating the samadhi through the 4 immeasurables, and also adding an element of wisdom, at least a tiny element of wisdom there. That would be in itself a way to turn ourselves into the most amazing human beings imaginable. However, as we might recall, 4 immeasurables can be thrown out of balance when we practice each one of them individually. And this is how they can be balanced with regards to each other. There are other antidotes that we could use to work with the false facsimiles, but there is this presentation where another immeasurable serves as a balancing agent to protect the primary measurable we're working with from turning into its false facsimile, from turning into its near enemy. So love or loving kindness, for love or loving kindness, the false facsimile or the near enemy is desire, and here it does not mean desire for coffee or desire to go to the bathroom. This refers to, as we can recall, the grasping desire that tries to control and smother and put up conditions and so forth, that level of sort of the vampire grasp, as one of my teachers sometimes described it. So what do we do when that starts arising? As you've mentioned today brilliantly, we need to transfer our attention to equanimity. They are their own subjects. They're not my property. I can't control them. I might try for 1 billion years, but I can't. And trust me, we all wish sometimes we could. We all sometimes wish we could control at least a small number of people, control as in help them, that's what we think, guide them, inspire them, support them, protect them, shepherd them. We are the good shepherd. We all think, in a way, secretly, in the corner of our mind, that we are the good shepherd for a number of beings. Maybe that's just for our cat and our roommate, maybe for more beings. The great political leaders of the world certainly think they're the good shepherds for their countries, and then sometimes they're absolutely delusional with regards to that. But then we have that within us, and to balance that, we need equanimity. We need to understand, hey, sometimes I just need to rest in equal-hearted tenderness that does not try to control anyone at all. Then, if our mind, when we are practicing equanimity, we're working with the 3 categories, we're releasing them, we're just resting in care, and then our mind turns into an indifferent and dull mind, a mind that is indifferent and dull. That's the false facsimile of equanimity, indifference. Oh, friends, enemies, and strangers don't really exist from their own side. These are just projections. We're all equal as beings, so I don't care at all. That's a false version of equanimity. Really, really not good or helpful at all, because it's just not caring. Equal care transformed into equal lack of care. So then we need to practice compassion, because compassion throws things into our face. Actually, this is one very interesting observation here. Sometimes people practice non-duality meditations that, although they claim to be old and ancient, are actually quite new. And that's why in religious studies, those forms of non-duality meditations are sometimes described as, for example, neo-Vedanta, as opposed to the actual old Vedanta practice, and so forth. But sort of a similar thing can happen with people who practice incorrectly. Emptiness meditations in Buddhism, people who practice somewhat incorrectly, Dzogchen and Mahamudra and so forth. So any type of non-duality practice is actually dangerous when it's done unskillfully or when it's described not properly. So then sometimes I've come across that multiple times. People say, well, I've done so much non-duality meditation, actually, I can't find any reason to care for anyone suffering because it's all illusory. There's no one here, no one there. There's no person. There's no personhood. Oh, this is a projection. Why should I care? So that's not really equanimity. That's not really a non-duality either. That's and also not enlightenment. It's also not wisdom. It's just indifference and dullness, the extreme of nihilism, essentially. So what I've seen as well is that that's what I've seen as an interpreter. When people with that problem come to experienced yogis and yoginis, and I've seen that several times, would gently invite them to do intense compassion practice. And that would break through that shell of false non-duality that is just indifference. Because when the actual suffering is in your face, and also you see how it came from causes and conditions, so it's all functional. It's not illusory in that regard. Things function. Causes do lead to results. When people see that, then that touches their heart, and there's the trembling of the heart as we've described it. And that then evolves into compassion. But of course, as we've established, compassion can accidentally transform into a sense of despair, a feeling of powerlessness. And then we need to focus on empathetic joy, which reminds us it's not all hopeless. There's joy in this world. There's good things happening in the world, even when things feel very dark. And there's good things happening in our own life, even when our own life feels very overwhelming and like we're powerless in it. Empathetic joy helps. And so we're focusing on that. But of course, empathetic joy also has a false facsimile. And that is when it transforms into a scattered and naively euphoric state. Just silly, giddy joy that is primarily focused on hedonic pleasures or a momentary bliss of meditation that we might have experienced, but is not yet ultimate transformation anyway. It's just passing things. We're ignoring that there can be greater suffering, and we're focusing on just these giddy pleasures of the moment. Then loving kindness helps to our aid, because loving kindness says, hey, kid, there's much greater, as me channeling Harrison Ford, there's much greater levels of well-being available. And you can attain those. You can aspire for them. So slowly. That's how we balance them with regards to each other. Then, for those who have read the Four Immeasurables book, or read books on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, or have taken teachings from Dr. Alan Wallace and so forth, they might have heard about the concepts of Mahamaitri, which is the great loving kindness, Mahakaruna, which is the great compassion. And then what's the difference between great compassion and immeasurable compassion? Because immeasurable compassion, since it covers all beings already, and remember we had several slides on what exactly is defined as immeasurable compassion by this author, that author, we talked about that. Well, immeasurable compassion at least needs to encompass all beings, embrace all beings with equal intensity, at least that. So what's the difference between immeasurable and great then? Well, in this context, great compassion is described as the level of compassion that is even more intense, in that it actually is so intense, so unbearable in a way, that it wants to take the responsibility for the happiness and freedom for all beings. So great loving kindness takes the responsibility for the happiness of all beings. Great compassion takes the responsibility for the freedom of all beings, their freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering. Great joy, and we wouldn't find the term Mahamudita per se, at least to my knowledge, but we would see teachings on it in the Tibetan tradition very strongly on that, and we would see prayers about it as well, quite frequently, especially frequently recited in the Gelug tradition. Great joy takes the responsibility for beings not being separated from sorrowless delight, sorrowless bliss. And then equanimity takes the responsibility for guiding all beings to equanimity, teaching all beings to be equanimous, to be impartial, to be open-hearted. So that's what they take the responsibility for. These mostly make sense within a Buddhist worldview, where we are operating within the framework of infinite lifetimes, infinite time, infinite space, or merely labeled time, merely labeled space. So in a way, within that framework, of course, we have the infinity of time and the infinity of space to accomplish these aspirations. So it's not meaningless. It's not stupid. It's not silly. It's not insane to wish to take the responsibility, because over time, why not? One being after another, we can liberate. And every being would be very grateful when they're liberated from suffering, for sure. For them, it would make a huge difference. So there's that, but there's a level of this available to us on a secular level as well, when we think, well, right now on this planet, all these sentient beings, I can contribute to the well-being of all these sentient beings. How? Well, by contributing to, for example, saving this planet. So there's an ecodharma level of great kindness and great compassion. It's not perhaps as intense as the ultimate transcendental one that goes beyond time and space and encompasses all the possible universes and so forth, as in the Buddhist tradition, but pretty great already, because we still do take the responsibility for the well-being of others, actively take responsibility, and then we start doing actions with it, hopefully wise action. So to cultivate these states, sometimes a fourfold meditation is done. We're not going to do it now, but I'm going to describe it. And within that meditation, this aspiration is recited. You would see it, I think, in the Four Immeasurables, the book as well, and you would frequently see it in different Gelugpa liturgies and sometimes in other texts as well. And the four elements of this formula, 4 steps of this meditation on, for example, a great loving kindness, are called immeasurable intention, immeasurable aspiration, immeasurable resolve, and immeasurable supplication. So what do we think on each stage? On the first stage, we think, how wonderful would it be if all sentient beings had happiness and the causes of happiness? Or that is sometimes also translated as, why couldn't all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness? Tibetan grammar allows for either version. So we think that, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if all beings had happiness? And then we generate loving kindness as we came to know it. May they have happiness and the causes of happiness. So we meditate on that, we rest on that. But then to go one next further, we generate so-called immeasurable resolve, which says, I myself will cause them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And that is where we would already need a certain level of wisdom, because this myself, this person that makes the promise or the wish to bring all beings to happiness and the causes of happiness, it can't just be this Lobsang Tenpa that will drop dead maybe tomorrow, maybe 50 years from now. It can't just be this person, because that's a very limited sort of bundle of interdependence that in its current configuration will only exist for a limited amount of time, not long enough to liberate all beings from suffering or to bring them all to happiness. But underlying that is a basic goodness. That is not going anywhere, not coming from anywhere, not abiding anywhere in a way, as in it will continue existing. Let's put it that way. That language is tricky here because we're talking about transcendental things in a way, but okay, that's good enough. So something deeper in us, our goodness, that is what says, I will cause them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And we actually need that level of transcendentness, even on a secular level, in that if we only think about our very limited body and our very limited human mind and our very limited human brain as well, well, it's all very limited. So when we compare this very limited human body, human mind, human brain against the immensity of, for example, all the ecological problems in this world, well, it's kind of not even David and Goliath kind of situation. It's immense, the difference in size and the proportions of the problem and our very humble abilities. But then we tap into compassion and we think, well, it's not even this person that needs to say that. Wisdom and compassion in me say, we ourselves will cause them to have happiness and the cause of happiness. And they're inseparable. So we could say, I myself will cause them to have happiness and the cause of happiness. And the same wisdom and compassion also abide in all other beings. And we also can combine to make affinity groups. We can work together. We come together as a community. We work on something. Wisdom and compassion working through us. It doesn't have to be, theistic or mystical or anything. Just qualities. Qualities within us say that. That's a helpful way to think. And then the last line, the last part of this aspiration, quite Buddhist, but it's also applicable in any other religious tradition. Inspire me to be able to do this, or bless me to be able to do this. Well, even on a secular level, we can think about all the great ancestors in the field that we work in, and we sort of mentally invite them to inspire us to be able to successfully complete whatever it is that we're doing. So if we're a surgeon, we're operating on a patient, we think back to our teachers and the great examples of the past, all the way back to the earliest doctors that treated humans, and we think, inspire me to help others in the way that you did. That's also very powerful, a very powerful practice to do. So of course, it makes sense here as well. And Buddhists here would supplicate their teacher and only enlightened ones and so forth. So that's how the fourfold formula of great loving kindness is used as a step-by-step meditation. Oops. So then we start with regular loving kindness, as in the one that we already have for some beings. And in a way, even if we make it very powerful, it can become what is described as Brahma-vihara in the Sanskrit tradition. Remember, we talked about the difference between how the divine abodes are defined in Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition. So in the Sanskrit tradition, because even the level of Brahma-vihara is still quite conditioned, a little bit self-referential, it still belongs to this regular level. Then eventually we might attain or realize immeasurable loving kindness. We talked about that, have some slides that you can revisit about that. How does it become truly, powerfully boundless and equally strong? Then comes the great loving kindness that we have just explored. And then on the basis of that, Buddhists of the Mahayana tradition would cultivate the so-called quality of bodhicitta, the essence of the Mahayana path. Quality of bodhicitta has two dimensions. One of them is just wisdom that knows the nature of reality. That's ultimate bodhicitta. The other one is an exceptional level of altruism, and that is the wish to become fully awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings. Why do we want to become fully awakened? For the benefit of all sentient beings. So bodhicitta is an incredibly powerful resolve, eventually so powerful it can never be even removed from our mind, it can never be broken, can never be discouraged, and so forth, once we have gone through many stages of cultivating it, of course. Bodhicitta is this incredible resolve to reach our final form, evolve to the ultimate level of evolution in terms of our eudaimonic well-being and our ability to serve others. Evolve to that ultimate form so as to benefit others. That's what bodhicitta is. And to even have that resolve, we need very strong levels of loving kindness and compassion that we first generate on an ordinary level, then ideally turned into a certain facsimile, at least, of immeasurable loving kindness and compassion, then turned into a certain facsimile, at least, of great loving kindness and great compassion, and then fused those two into bodhicitta. And for that, there are special analytical meditations that are done, but beyond that, there's an incredible amount of bodhicitta in practice that we do. We try to maintain that aspiration while doing all sorts of things, while reacting to beings, talking to them, opening the doors, closing the doors, opening windows, closing windows, cooking food, going to the bathroom, and so forth. That resolve eventually, for those who are on this path, needs to pervade every aspect, every facet, every cell, every facet of the mind of the practitioner, and become truly irreversible, and also merged with the ultimate bodhicitta, which is knowing the ultimate nature of reality. And those two are in an interesting relationship, because for some, ultimate one comes after the relative one, the altruistic resolve. And then for some, for rare beings, actually glimpses of ultimate bodhicitta, glimpses of knowing true nature of reality, naturally give rise to loving kindness and immeasurable loving kindness and great loving kindness and bodhicitta, that is the conventional bodhicitta, the aspiration. So there's a beautiful dance there. And a large part of the teachings of the great vehicle tradition in Buddhism, and of course the Tibetan tradition belongs to that whole bandwidth, or very strongly carries that bandwidth and supports it in this world and preserves it in this world and practices it in this world. All of this actually revolves around this path in a way. It's the essence of the path in one way. We could say, put it like that. Okay, Well, then what's giving and taking? What's the so-called popular practice of Tonglen? And I should say with a little bit of exasperation that when you open different meditation apps or you search for things on YouTube or sound platforms and so forth, you would find a billion versions of Tonglen practice, and sometimes they would be just recorded by people who have no connection to the Tibetan tradition whatsoever. And that's not a problem in that it's not about gatekeeping. It's that there's also value in honoring the roots of this practice. And the roots of this practice are that it's not simply a fun method to visualize things to strengthen our compassion. Even in the Tibetan tradition, you would sometimes find popular books where it's just, you would hear, oh, bodhicitta is the practice of compassion, or giving and taking is practice of compassion, and bodhicitta is like a mixture, all the things mashed together. Actually, whereas they have specific definitions and their own place in the framework of practice. So within that, it would be nice to say and explain that traditionally giving and taking was a very special practice that came originally from India or was inspired by certain teachings in India and Indonesia. This lineage practice also came from Indonesia through an Indian master who eventually brought it to Tibet. And then in Tibet, it was for a while preserved as a secret practice because it's very radical, but also because the actual way of doing it is not what is currently recorded and presented in all these platforms. And this is where we can appreciate those roots and those more powerful forms of this practice that we can slowly study. And we can also, yes, see that essentially it's a way of combining loving kindness and compassion. But in the traditional setting, and traditional here does not mean, old-fashioned or anything like that, or sectarian or limited or outdated. In the traditional context, Tonglen is a practice specifically for cultivating bodhicitta. And before doing Tonglen, practitioners would do other types of meditation called equalizing and exchanging self and others. And these are very powerful practice for expanding our sense of identity. They can be practiced to a certain degree on a secular level. Sometimes they are. And then beyond, after we've accomplished those, we practice Tonglen itself. But these days, Tonglen is sometimes taught just openly to anyone, but it's taught in a much more simplified form. So there's no problem with that. However, the essence of this practice, to describe it very briefly, and then we can do it very short in a very abbreviated manner. The essence of this practice is that we use our creative imagination and our understanding that all things are interdependent and also empty in a way. We use that to, with compassion, take, in terms of our imagination, take the suffering of all beings upon ourselves and either use it to attack our tunnel vision, or we just dissolve it into the basic nature, the radiant nature of our own mind. So it's not like we take all that suffering and we keep it in our body and let it fester there. That's never the thing. We either use it to attack our tunnel vision in some versions of the practice, or we dissolve it into the spaciousness that at the heart of our being, thus actually accessing that spaciousness to a greater degree. So we take the suffering, that's the taking part, and then we give, we imagine that we give all of our resources, happiness, our positive karma, everything that we have, all types of delights to all beings, and they enjoy those. And that's, of course, wonderful and beautiful. So that's loving kindness. So with compassion, taking, with loving kindness, giving. And the point of this practice, primarily for most of us, is about cultivating exceptional levels of courage, compassion, and loving kindness. The point is not to think, oh, I'll do this, and then this person would necessarily feel better. Even though, as Dr. Wallace describes in the book, sometimes there is an effect on outer reality. But one thing we shouldn't really worry about is that we're going to do this practice and we're going to take someone's disease upon ourselves and so forth. To actually be able to, even in the Buddhist worldview, to actually be able to do something like that takes an incredible degree of spiritual realization. So that's not a thing. However, Of course, there's the placebo effect and the nocebo effect. Those two can be at play sometimes, but most of the time, the greatest effect we would notice is that our practice of compassion, love, and wisdom becomes stronger. Why? Wisdom reminds us of the spaciousness at the core of our being. That's the version of practice that we'll do right now briefly. And love and compassion are what we practice with when we give and when we take. So we'll do a simple version of this practice, not too graphic, not too detailed, just gentle, because we don't want to overdo it in this initial stage. And so please find a comfortable stationary position. We'll do the practice of giving and taking by first accessing this stillness, the silence, and the spaciousness at the core of our being. From the vantage point of view of these three qualities, and especially spaciousness, all of our conditioned experiences unfold, including the experience of this body resting here, the experience of my voice, and so forth. And within this spaciousness, we can also manifest ideas and images that would help us strengthen qualities of love and compassion. So let's think of ourselves as sitting in front of us, imagining ourselves sitting in front of us. And then around ourselves, we can imagine all the other sentient beings. Specific beings that come to mind, or just beings in general. For this beginner level practice, we will not get too detailed with that. But when we look at ourselves and then by extension on others, we can remind ourselves that this person, that is me, and other beings are subjects to their experience. They feel pain, they feel joy, they want to be happy, they want to be free from suffering. And there's a lot of joys that they lack, and a lot of types of pain that they experience. So with that, we can start with a little bit of giving. This person sitting in front of us, that is us, and all these other beings could certainly use a little bit more joy, happiness, well-being. So we can imagine that out of the boundless radiant nature in the center of our chest, out of the boundless spaciousness and the core of our being, come all types of happiness, well-being, all types of gifts and types of support that these beings might need. And they move towards these beings and they are given to them. While some meditations suggest simply imagining light here, there's benefit in being graphic. So if we want to imagine food for the hungry, medicine for the sick, drinks for those who are thirsty, safe places for those who are in danger, and so forth, there's benefit in that. So giving. Not simply sharing the limited resources of joy that we ourselves have, even though that's part of it, but also tapping into the limitless well at the heart of our being and sharing the infinity of well-being from there. And then with compassion, taking. First, noticing that beings experience different types of suffering. That includes us, because we're also an object of this meditation, and others. Different types of discomfort and causes of discomfort. Poverty, sickness, depression, stress. Being in dangerous areas, being oppressed, and so forth. How wonderful would it be to lift all of that, to remove that from beings, to dissolve all of it. And since to remove suffering, we need to break through our indifference, we imagine that we take the suffering on, as in it leaves beings. And some people like to imagine dark smoke as the symbol of that suffering, or tiny dark particles, but we can use any imagery, any type of imagery that works for us. That suffering leaves beings, literally separating from their body and mind, and it streams towards us. And then it enters us and it dissolves in the radiant, spacious core of our being. Dissolves as in disappears. There's nothing to hold on to. And upon imagining that beings have indeed become free, for a very short while, we can imagine giving once again, just to now bring their bliss and happiness to full fruition, full flourishing. So once again, a stream of everything that they need to bring them to the highest levels of eudaimonic well-being, supported by balanced types of hedonia. And then releasing these images, the aspirations, the thoughts, even the compassion and loving kindness, to rest in the radiant nature of spaciousness that served as the foundation for this practice. And then concluding it. In the chat here, there's a request to elaborate a bit more about the special training in Tonglen. We don't have enough time for sure, and that is a very large topic because Tonglen can be its own 10-part course. I would then just say that the special trainings that precede Tonglen, they're not to make it more safe, perhaps, because the version that we just did, it's not unsafe. Its nature. Those special trainings are to make it more powerful, actually, more intense, more transformative. That's why they're done. Practices of equalizing and exchanging self and others are done to make Tonglen a more transformative practice, and not just a nice way to combine compassion and loving kindness, which is still very, very wonderful. But that's the roots, the historical roots of Tonglen. And then all of that would be done to cultivate eventually bodhicitta. So that's just a very brief introduction to this, because of course we would see Tonglen a lot when talking about loving kindness and compassion. And some people think, quite falsely, quite wrongly, that Tonglen is the only or the main practice for cultivating compassion in the Tibetan tradition. It's a practice, and it's very important practice, but the root training in compassion that is generating compassion by generating the aspirations, that's certainly right there in the Tibetan tradition and in other traditions. So Tonglen does not replace that. It is a thing that we use on the basis of actual meditations on the four immeasurables that we have been doing. And then one final slide, perhaps, before we conclude, two additional tools that we use sometimes to cultivate the four immeasurables and to strengthen them, to make them more powerful. One of these tools is so-called gathas, which is a tool famous for those who are familiar with the works of Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, and the practice of his community, but also with traditional practices of many other communities across the world. Gathas are essentially mindfulness verses that remind us of a specific key of practice. There are many gathas like that for practicing the four immeasurables, mindfulness, mindful breathing, mindful walking, and so forth. And sometimes we would see those, but sort of a version of gathas, we could say, is simple wishes that we can combine with simple actions that we do daily, with those wishes expressing the essence of compassion, loving kindness, or bodhicitta. And that is something that is strongly used in the Chinese tradition and also sometimes used in the Tibetan tradition, such as wishing, I don't know, opening the door and thinking, may the door to awakening be open for all beings. May the door to happiness be open for all beings, to make it a bit more simple, and so forth. So those are mindfulness formulas or mindfulness verses. There are many of those, and we can write them for ourselves as well if we find inspiration for that. And then aspirational prayers, something that we would see a lot in the Tibetan tradition. Sometimes whole festivals of those are organized, and one of those festivals is happening right now in Europe, where number of senior masters of one of the lineages, they come together, a lot of lay followers, monks, nuns, and so forth, practitioners from all walks of life come together, and for days and days and days, they recite elaborate aspirational prayers or formulas that express loving kindness and compassion in different ways. Why is that done? Well, to motivate us to do compassionate action in this world, to program our mind to be compassionate, even in our future lives, if we accept those, and also in this life, of course, and also to affect the overall interdependence and to seal our practice sometimes. That's one reason for why it's done. And so right now, there's benefit perhaps in sealing this course by reciting, if you wish, some aspirations of this nature from Shantideva, who is also, incidentally, one of the primary sources for Tonglen practice, or predecessors of the Tonglen tradition. So Shantideva, in his most famous text, and he wrote 3 texts, 2 of which extant, one of them is studied very, very extensively, called The Way of the Entry to the Bodhisattva Way of Life. There are other translations as well. Shantideva writes many, brings up many of these beautiful verses. So they are a nice way to end any class, including this one. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and other delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May they be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are ill and injured quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may these never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space endures, and as long as living beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. This last one is known as the famous favorite prayer of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. For a while, I think, and maybe even now, it was right there on the banner of his website. he often or always recites this multiple times a day, strengthening his own aspirations of loving kindness and compassion. So may our love and compassion equally grow and then be expressed through our positive behavior. I think participating together in this, co-organizing this, practicing together is a wonderful way to express all of that. I'm very grateful for all of you showing up. And I'm very much looking forward to reconnecting, hopefully next weekend. I'm still very much inviting all of you to join our session on joy with Christian and my brief discussion of connection between these practices and more advanced methods in the Buddhist tradition and so forth. So that will be 2 more fun events to practice together, all of these things. And for now, I very much apologize for taking up extra time. Very grateful to all of you. So with a deep bow, with this, I would like to conclude this session and see you next time. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.